Information Management, Mrs. Claudette Thomas, Government Archivist, the Jamaica Archives and Records Department, JARD, Mr. Wayne Thompson, Principal Director, Public Sector Modernization Division in the Office of the Cabinet, Mr. Damien Cox, Acting Principal Director, Information Division in the Office of the Prime Minister, our distinguished panelists who are with us and those that are online, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished ladies and gentlemen all, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
It is indeed a good morning, and I'm happy to be here with you as we celebrate and officially launch the Records Information Management RIM Month of Activities. The Jamaica Archives and Records Department, JARD, has been around for many years. In fact, they're celebrating, I believe, some 60 years this year, and I think that is quite an achievement worthy of a round of applause. The theme for this month of activities is Transforming Information and Records Management, Bridging the Gap. And we have a very interesting forum planned for you this morning as we kick things off. Of course, there are several other activities that will take place throughout the month, and we will tell you about them as we go along. But for right now, we're going to get started with our launch, and then later on we'll get into the discussion. It is such an important aspect of our lives, our history, of all the things that we cherish. And in just preparing for today's program, I learned quite a bit about JARD. And I certainly have need for some of those services that they provide. With a mission to ensure efficient and effective management and use of official records or information at all stages of the life cycle, and to preserve those official and other archival records for current and future use by the government and citizens of Jamaica. All of this in order to strengthen national development. What a mission. Very, very important. And we celebrate that today. My job is to weave the program together. I'm going to be as expeditious as I can be with the use of time. And later on, I will assist in asking the questions, and I certainly hope that you will have questions as well. We want to welcome those that are on the GIS platform, because we are streaming live, and we also want to welcome RGR 94 FM. They're doing a live outside broadcast at this time as well. But let us begin with a prayer, and that prayer, ladies and gentlemen, is our national anthem. May I invite us to stand. You may be seated. Jamaica, land we love. Coming at this time with the opening remarks is a lady who is an information professional, has been for over 25 years. She's a facilitator with multiple records and management certifications. She's our government archivist from the Jamaica Archives and Records Department, JARD. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Mrs. Claudette Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Masters of Ceremonies. Honorable Robert Nestor Morgan, Minister without Portfolio Information in the Office of the Prime Minister. Mr. Wayne Thompson, Principal Director, the Public Sector Modernization Division. Our keynote speaker, Mr. Emerson Bryan, Certified Archivist in Information Management. Mr. Damian Cox, Acting Principal Director, Information Division, Office of the Prime Minister. To you who are here, present, and those of you who have joined us on this platform, good morning. Every year, records and information management professionals around the world promote records-related activities, especially across the public sector during the month of April. This year, Jamaica Archives and Records Department, we refer to ourselves as JARD, is collaborating with the Archives Advisory Committee, information management professionals and practitioners to commemorate Records and Information Month activities. Additionally, the special, very significant milestone of 60th anniversary is quite fitting to be aligned to this campaign. And our 2020 activities will flow from the month of April and beyond. So on February 15, 2022, the Diamond Jubilee year of the archives, Jamaica Archives, commenced, and we intend to have a lot of activities, and we are inviting all who are here to join us as we showcase work and contribution of government archivists and testimonials of researchers who have utilized the collection which we seek to use to preserve the documentary heritage of our country. I'd like to really pause to mention a significant or distinguished Jamaican, the name Clinton Black. Does it ring a bell? History of Jamaica. Now, he was the first appointed government archivist. He was appointed in February 1955. And if we check the Gleaner article, there's a Gleaner article, remembering distinguished Jamaicans, Clinton Black, that of April 3, we would have learned a little more of his life. But I'd like to share that he was instrumental in the construction of the first archives within the Caribbean in 1962. We had that opening, and members of the Archives Advisory Committee were also there. Now, JARD is the department of the Office of the Prime Minister, and we are here seeking to share with the public all that we do. We will be publishing our Rimzin magazine later this month. It will be circulated, and we will be engaging practitioners and professionals in webinars on the 20th and 27th, and also facilitating virtual tours of JARD. Today, we are going to be reminded that transforming information and records management will require us to bridge a gap. Now, how are we going to transmit this information, this message? Information is considered a key component of government or operations and should be treated as an asset. Similar to us looking at the financial, human, and physical resources, the good management of information is critical to any efficient running of an organization. There is also that need to include this information concept in the strategic approach of the country or the organization. But in doing that, we need to identify gaps. Some gaps we noticed: inadequate ICT resources, limited skilled information professionals with adequate cutting-edge capabilities or competencies. We are also faced with the risk of the loss of the documentary heritage. But today's presentations, the public forum, we will learn a little more about the connection between technology and records management, how crucial it is for us to manage the records in our organization and in our country. So the government of Jamaica sought to remedy some of the lack or gaps which existed. And in 2018, we had a RIM policy, which was approved by Cabinet Decision 2518. The purpose of that policy is to establish standards in managing official records and an adherence to international best practices. So, record keeping is key. And it was established under 4 subheadings. We had that for the review of the legislation, for capacitation and identifying human resources, also for a strategic review and strengthening of JARD, and number 4, for the implementation of RIM right across government. We are seeking to accomplish this goal within 3 levels at the short, medium, and long term. So, as we seek to implement, we have established cohorts. We have had cohort 1, 2, and 3. We have started implementation of the RIM program with these cohorts, which number approximately 39 entities, ministries, departments, and agencies. So as I seek to close, I am impressing on us as we seek to look at the transformation and the way forward in building information and records management, remembering that it is key to the country's rich heritage, and JARD is among its key stakeholders are leading the charge. So today I invite you to join with us as we celebrate, but also learn how we could support each other in this process to transform records and information management to make Jamaica a place of choice that we would want to live, do business, and raise our families. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
And thank you very much, Mrs. Thomas. Information is an asset, and I certainly agree with that one. And the management of this information is even more critical to our success as a nation. It is the key to our rich heritage. Thank you. Allow me to acknowledge Ms. A.C. White, who is a member of the Archives Advisory Board. She's with us this morning. And to introduce you to our next presenter. Now, Mr. Wayne Thompson is the Principal Director of the Public Sector Modernization Division in the Office of the Cabinet, and I believe he's particularly proud about the implementation of RIM entities, which is really in line with the Government of Jamaica's digitization thrust. And he's here this morning, and I'd like for you to make him welcome as he comes with his greetings. So put your hands together for Mr. Wayne Thompson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Marlene Stevenson, a familiar face. It's good to see you again. Our Minister, the Honorable Robert Nestor Morgan. Our archivist, Mrs. Thomas, Claudette Thomas. And Mr. Emerson Brand, our keynote speaker. It's good to see you also, Mr. Brand. I just want to, in keeping with the spirit of the partnership, to welcome those of us who are here, the family that is listening, and the family includes everybody from the MDA, the Cabinet Office, OPM, and JARD, as we seek to celebrate this 60th anniversary in style. It's really a pleasure and honor to extend greetings on behalf of the Office of the Cabinet, Public Sector Modernization Division, in recognition of RIM Month. Allow me to first salute our RIM professionals. And it's always important to remember them. They are the ones that have been toiling for us as we seek to create a different environment, one that is competitive and one that will allow for us to grow as a nation. So I really want to acknowledge them, because sometimes those persons are not really seen. Those who are working behind the scenes, they are never generally seen. And we're the ones who would get the glory. So I really want to extend our personal commendation to the work that you would have done, and our me in the Cabinet Office, and by extension, the partnership, for the significant work that you would have done. You are the guardian and preservers of all official government records. You hold the awesome responsibility to ensure the systems are in place to manage the veracity of records in your custody from creation to disposition. It's good that I could see the smile on some of the faces, which would suggest to me that you truly appreciate even the role that you play as part of this important partnership. The partnership between the Information Division and the Office of the Cabinet around RIM program is significant, as it demonstrates the critical role of information management in the government modernization process. And by the way, I just want us to understand and appreciate that this is not just a problem of Jamaica. It's a worldwide problem. But we recognize the quicker we respond is the better we're able to compete in a global environment, and which is why this partnership is so important. The program is directly aligned to the Public Sector Transformation Program, which is a government-wide initiative that aims to meet the challenges of Jamaica economic growth, the creation of performance-driven public institutions that are serving our people and businesses with better and faster solutions that help our business to compete and to provide a greater level of efficiencies for the public. The role of the Office of the Cabinet in the RIM program is long established and dated to 2012 when we signed that agreement, that's the Memorandum of Understanding, with the Ministry with responsibility for information, the Office of the Prime Minister, and the Jamaica Archives and Records Department to modernize records and information management systems in the public sector. Specifically, the MOU aimed to improve digitization capacity, establishment of a digital archives database with JAR, developing a comprehensive policy framework, and developing the institutional capacity across government to implement RIM. And by the way, the lessons would have learned from many transformations is that the people are the core to your reform. Sometimes we tend to forget them, but it's important, and this is why our efforts are so deliberate. As a team, we're collectively working to ensure our initiatives towards Vision 2030 are achieved. And by the way, I just want to mention, because some of us tend to forget, that one of the very important sustainable development goals is the same partnership. Partnerships, critical. And it's a lesson we would have learned. Sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't. But if we're going to be competitive as a nation, we have to be able to work together. It's important that I pause, Chairman, to recognize the work of the minister. Now, it feels as if he's here a long time, working with us. And it's just based on the work that we have achieved and how we would have been feeling it from our end. Minister, I really want to commend you for the leadership. The work, we're fully aware, has just begun. There's a lot for us to do. But I want to commend you and the staff, the leadership of the OPM, and those MDAs who would have seen it fit to work with us through thick and thin to ensure that RIM implementation is a priority. The implications for RIM, as a records management program, are significant, and I'll highlight a few. RIM lays the foundation to Jamaica being transitioned into a digital economy. Now, we would have learned by now that it's going to be difficult for us to transform in a very rapid way without the necessary standards. As you are aware, standards drives service excellence. And that is part of the mission, to create the environment that will allow for us to, in a very strategic way, to use RIM to revolutionize our economy. Additionally, RIM will allow for the creation of more robust systems. And we'll talk about robust systems. Systems are not being developed to drive just an entity, because we have gone past that. If we're not developing the systems to span functional areas, you're going to be losing the value, because that's how you deal with supply chain issues, to improve the value chain. So we have gone a step further through the Cabinet Office to recognize that, yes, we have done well in preparing individual entities, in terms of the readiness. So we are now ready for the radical changes, and which is why RIM is one of the focus at this time. In closing, as the Office of the Cabinet continues to partner, as the Office of the Cabinet continues its partnership under the RIM program, the vision of an integrated information and communication technology landscape, as articulated under the National Development Plan, is taking form, and we are pleased that we have several government entities on board, with others making their own advances down the proverbial wicket towards full implementation. RIM Month is really an opportunity for us to again highlight the joined-up government approach to ensure the efficiency and the ease of doing business, while also engaging in the knowledge-sharing exercises in the form of training and other opportunities. At the end of our month-long celebration, under the theme Transforming Information and Records Management, Building the Gap, I trust our commitment and the skill set to advance Jamaica's records and information management system will be forever stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. I think we can do a little better than that. Yes. In unity there is indeed strength. And I also want to add my bit of congratulations to the guardians, the preservers of our government records, because having had to use some of these records and having had to try to retrieve some of these records over my own years of experience, I know how important it is for the record to be true. He spoke about the veracity of the record from creation to disposition, and that is so important. Sometimes we don't stop to highlight a lot of these persons, as he said, who work in the background to make these things happen. But if they're not doing their jobs, then we will know, because we will make a lot of noise. So thank you very much, Mr. Thompson, for the work that you do and for the partnerships that have been forged through records information management. And as we grow and get stronger and more competitive, each and every one, I believe, in this room will have an important role to play. You know, we always operate in a historical context, a cultural context. And in true Jamaican form, we're going to have a little bit of entertainment for you at this time. And it might just inspire you, not just entertain you. From 7 Miles, Bull Bay Church of God of Prophecy, I believe we have a group that will be performing for us at this time. And the performance is entitled Press. So give it up for them as they come.
Troubled on every side. Sometimes I don't want to try to move on when it seems there's nothing left. Lord, I need you to step in. Give me a second wind. Lord, with your help,
giving us some encouragement there. I will press even when I'm stressed. I will press even when my life's a mess. When things become difficult and things become hard. What are we going to do? Press. Thank you very much for that encouragement this morning. Let me hear it one more time for our friends from the Bull Bay Church of God of Prophecy. Ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Woodhall in Clarendon, we have a young gentleman who served as Director of Communications in the Office of the Prime Minister between 2016 and 2019, and as Parliamentary Secretary in the Office of the Prime Minister between 2019 and 2020. You know, he wears several hats. He's a hard worker, and he's an attorney at law. He's a communication specialist. And recently he has been given responsibility for information in the Office of the Prime Minister. I'd like for you to put your hands together and make him welcome at this time. I speak of none other than the Honorable Robert Nestor Morgan, Minister without Portfolio in the Office of the Prime Minister, Jamaica. Let me hear it.
Thank you very much, Marlene. I'm going to get that recording and put it by my bedside as my wake-up call. What was the name of that program that you had in the mornings? Marlene in the mornings. See? Works. Thank you very much. And before I start, they don't know the history. I mean, we grew up with Marlene Stevenson. From Marlene in the mornings to School Challenge Quiz, we used to journey on a bus from Clarendon College called the Kalamazoo. It was a old Tata bus to Kingston to go to School Challenge Quiz. And one of the most refreshing things about it is the reassuring voice of Marlene when she asked the questions. Even if you're wrong, you felt that you had a good chance. So thank you very much, Marlene, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. But I want to also recognize Mr. Cox, Damien Cox, who is the Acting Principal Director of the Information Division, as well as Mrs. Claudette Thomas. Nice to see you again, Claudette. Mr. Emerson Bryan, who is a Certified Archivist in Information Management. Mr. Dwayne Brissett. He's online. All right. Information Services Communications Manager, Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court. Also, my good friend, Mr. Wayne Thompson. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you for the invitation. And Ms. Tamika Clough, Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Registrar General's Department, Dr. Patrick Anglin, University of the West Indies Data Protection Officer, and the lovely Master of Ceremonies, Mrs. Marlene Stevenson. Dalian, to you, the audience, I must apologize for being late. I'm not usually late, so I want to sincerely apologize for that. I had post-cabinet press briefing and the journalists decided that they had more questions than normal today. Exciting times in Jamaica, at least. And I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of those online and those listening on radio. A very interesting period. We're now doing hybrid live and Zoom at the same time. I saw an article where people are going to work to have Zoom meetings. So even though you're at work, you're still in the Zoom meetings. It's a very fascinating development in the world. I'm really pleased to participate in these proceedings today. And as you may have recognized, I was recently appointed Minister without Portfolio with responsibility. And I always make the distinction that I have responsibility, I'm not in charge. The Prime Minister is the minister. I am the one who he has delegated authority to manage. I am very familiar with JARD and the record information management sectors, as while I was Minister of State in the Ministry of Education, Youth, and at the time Information. I had a very close relationship with Mr. Cox and Dwayne, who is no longer here. I think that the the Archives and Records Department forms part of one of the most important aspects of the government. You don't see them generally. You don't know their impact. But at a meeting recently with Ms. Thomas, and I said, what would happen if one of our archives burned down? And I put it as stark as that because we were discussing the need to improve the fire system there. And she said, well, we would probably lose 30 years of our government records. Now, imagine if you woke up one morning and lost 30 years of your memory. So, persons don't, I think, appreciate the tremendous importance of the work that the Jamaica Archives and Records Department does. It is the memory of our country. It is the institutional wisdom that we can go back to from time to time and review to inform ourselves about how to plan for the future. I think Marcus Garvey was the one who said, a nation without knowledge of its history is like a tree without roots. The Jamaica Archives and Records Department is the roots, are the roots. I'm messing up my plurals, Marlene. I apologize. Of our society. And I think we have an obligation, as not just government, but as implementers, technocrats, to educate the population as to the value of our national records and archives. And I'm very happy to echo the Prime Minister's announcement in his recent budget presentation of what we call G-data, which is government data, where we're seeking to create purpose-built archive facilities that are climate resilient, that are disaster resilient, and that can assist us with continuity of government if something bad should happen, so that the history, the culture of Jamaica, the decisions that we've made and the reasoning behind those decisions can be preserved for future generations. I think we should give the Prime Minister a little bit of applause for that one. So the Records and Information Management Month is actually an annual global celebration for all records and information management professionals and practitioners, and seeks to reinforce the importance of all aspects of the field and to highlight the impact on our ministries, agencies, and departments in order to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the existing government of Jamaica record systems. In alignment with Records and Information Management RIM Month 2022, we also commemorate the Jamaica Archives and Records Department Diamond Jubilee, that's 60 years. So we correspond with independence. That's very important. Diamond Jubilee, and congratulate them on 60 years of sterling contribution to the enhancement and furtherance of national development. Tasked with the mandate of ensuring quality service through the preservation of those records which have archival value and ensuring quality management of all official records, the Jamaica Archives and Records Department, JARD, has played an integral role in the modernization of the record and information management systems. Through their hands-on guidance and support, they have begun the transformation of how several ministries, agencies, and departments now treat official records detailing the activities of the government of Jamaica. I look forward to a successful partnership in attaining the ideal standards across the entirety of the public sector, and that is the official message that they wrote for me. Now I will give you my personal message. My personal message is that I think the government has become seized with the importance of our history. I think the government has become seized with the importance of the preservation of our history. Post-colonial, post-slavery societies usually do not have long histories. Many of us are unable to trace our roots back to where our ancestors came from. If you go to other countries and you see, let's say, a Jewish person or an Italian person or an Irish person, they can trace back their history to hundreds, if not even over 1,000 years. I was recently looking at the family tree of Queen Elizabeth, and you could trace it back to 1100. Now, imagine a Jamaican in 2100 being able to trace back their information and what the government of Jamaica as an independent society was able to do in 1962. To go to a facility that they can do research and find some connectivity between their current reality in 2100 and what we were doing in 1962. Rex Nettleford would call that smodification. You're making the person into an individual with a history, with a root, with a connection to their ancestry. It is not surprising that some societies are stronger than others, because they have a whole reservoir of history from which to learn. And I think we take it for granted, the work of our RIM professionals and the Jamaica Archives and Records Department, because they're unseen. They are not on TV every day because their hard task is to collating, categorizing, and storing our documents. But has anybody here ever done a genealogy survey of your family? Or has anybody here ever looked at the discussions about how our Constitution was framed and what happened in Parliament, the deliberations on it? And I think the challenge with us as a society is that we become a society of immediate gratification, where many of us no longer see the importance of deep research. Because a lot of the questions that we ask ourselves in 2022 could be answered by doing a little research about what happened in 1962. Why is it that the Queen is deeply entrenched in the Constitution when Barbados could move from a republic from a monarchical democracy to a republic by a simple majority? Jamaica requires a long process of a majority of all members of parliament, and then 6 months of consultations in the public and so on. There's a reason why these things exist in our society. But we're not going to find out because we're not going to look for it. And that's why I think that one of the most important things in the new direction, in terms of creating data centers, in terms of digitizing our information, we can give easier access to persons who want to do research and are interested to find out why things are sometimes the way they are, and also can inform them as to the best approach to make changes. The future of our archives is the future of data. I've always said to persons, ever since we were starting the discussion about needs, that data is now a commodity. I don't know if we can quantify the value of the data held in the National Archives. I don't think you can, because it's not replaceable. Even your personal data is now a commodity. You will note, if you go online, that person's personal data is being traded for cents on the dollar, because it is now a value. The personhood is now represented by your data. And with the evolution with NIDS, National Identification System, National NIRA, which is the National Identification and Registration Authority, the importance of good archival practices and the protection of our national data is becoming more prominent. You would have heard on occasions, persons' data has been stolen and they've lost all their money in their bank account, they've lost their identity. And that's because in some cases there have been breaches of data. And the holistic approach of the government is to look at how do we empower people to use data for their benefit while at the same time protecting the data from unscrupulous persons. And a part of the transformation with the Public Sector Transformation Unit, as well as going forward working with our government archivists and our team and looking at the framework of building out G-data where we have probably tiered security concerns. So you know you have needs that is at the top where you cannot disclose anybody's personal information, but then you have archival data dating back 50, 60 years that researchers need access to. Plus you have museum data, official records from way back when, including slave journals about who was a slave and what was their name. We have to give our people easier access to this information so that they can be informed. And the access doesn't mean, as we found out recently, that they have to go to Spanish Town or downtown. The access should mean that they can go on a portal and they can bring up information. We had an incident the other day where a researcher was here for months trying to do some research. And because of COVID, she could not attend upon the Archives and Records Department because no one is allowed inside because of needs and because of other safety concerns. Now imagine if you could go on your computer and bring up all the birth records from 1838 to 1962, and you never had to leave your home. That's what COVID has been teaching us, that we need to leapfrog the technology. We need to empower people through the use of technology to give them access. And that way, I think, we'll be able to build a stronger recognition of the importance of the work that people like our government archivist is doing, where people will now finally, in my estimation, see our National Archives and Records and RIM professionals as people of tremendous importance to the development of Jamaica, as people who are contributing to the preservation of our democracy, who can assist us in improving our way of life. And that's my personal greeting. I don't know if it was a greeting. But I want to thank you very much for coming out. I want to express appreciation to the organizers as well as members of the media who are here, JIS, and you, the audience. I want to also thank you for listening. Hopefully something I said was of importance. And I also want to thank our RIM professionals. It is your month, and the Jamaica Archives and Records Department. And to the guest speaker, I humbly await your wisdom, and hopefully I will learn something as well. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Minister. That was much food for thought. And I believe as the world turns, we must turn with it. Sounds very nice when you talk about data centers and accessibility, data centers that are fit for purpose, and I could stay in my living room and get the information. I think it was just 2 days ago I went onto the JARD website and I realized that much of the information from the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation resides with JARD, even though you need to access it through the PBCJ. And I thought to myself, maybe I should test the services and see if you could find me something from 1997. And I'm going to ask Miss Thomas when we're finished here today to see if I can retrieve that record. It's something that's personal and important. And we'll see. Because you talk about standards and excellence in service and all of that. And that's what I want to see happening consistently. So thank you, Minister. Thank you for sharing with us today. And allow me now to introduce to you our keynote speaker for today. He has a long biography. He's decorated. He's many, many years of experience as an information management specialist, a certified archivist from the Academy of Certified Archivists, ACA. Over 20 years of information, knowledge, and project management experience from diverse roles across various industries, a certified records analyst. And Mr. Brian, a lot has been happening with you. You have been making significant contribution, not just to us here in Jamaica, but in Barbados and other parts of the world. His areas of specialization are information governance, archives, records management, museum management, digital business transformation, knowledge management. And there's so much more that I could say about him. But at this time, please make welcome certified archivist in information management, our keynote speaker, Mr. Emerson Bryan.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Madam Master of Ceremonies. I shall observe the protocol established by my predecessors. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the government archivist, Mrs. Thomas, who invited me to speak today, and Mr. Wayne Thompson, who I've known from prior undertakings, and Honorable Minister Morgan, thank you so much, and Mr. Damien Cox, a pleasure. I would like to also acknowledge those that are joining us online and on the radio. Thank you for taking the time out to tune in, and also those custodians, professionals working in the MDAs who are right at this given time doing what they're supposed to do. They're filing, they're managing the records of the government to ensure that government can remain operational. I had some prepared remarks, but I believe that it might be more useful to have a conversation. But before I jump right into the presentation, it's a real honor. I stand humbled to be here on this platform. I remember when I would have started out in the government of Jamaica back in 1997 as a records clerk. I met Elizabeth Williams, who was a government archivist, and Michelle Creed Nelson. I'd like to use this opportunity to acknowledge how they mentored me and allowed me to be where I'm at right now. It's a very difficult undertaking to be working in government, providing this kind of service. It's monotonous, it's not sexy, it's very difficult. Sometimes, depending on the environment, it's a hostile work environment. Spare a thought for persons who are working with information assets that are not your paper-based information assets, but might be, for example, cartographic records, right? National Land Agency. Most people encounter these records in a digitized format, but it starts somewhere. There has to be a beginning of this process, and I just want to acknowledge the contributions of those persons who are involved with this kind of work. So I'll be speaking about the advantages and disadvantages of cloud storage. Before I begin the conversation, I believe it's useful to set the context. What do we mean by cloud computing? There are many definitions around, but the definition I like to acknowledge is the definition given by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which basically defines cloud as it's a virtual space, right? Before, when we used to have a scenario where you had to go out to tender to purchase a platform. That's no longer the case. The cloud has made such arrangements almost redundant. And there are, of course, various deployments in terms of cloud deployments. There is software as a service. This is where the provider or the consultant would provide a platform where, again, in the same scenario that I just painted, you're accessing a turnkey platform, right, or turnkey service. There is the platform as a service deployment where, for example, platforms such as for-pay platforms such as on Amazon, you're able to tap into that platform without having to worry about setting up any specialized arrangements other than ensuring that your financial information is registered on that platform. And of course, there's infrastructure as a service where you may have access to a data warehouse and such. These are deployments that you don't need to concern yourselves about as information management professionals, but for which you need to have some knowledge in terms of how you're going to go about accessing or procuring these platforms to ensure that the information assets would be managed from creation right through to full disposition. And when we talk about full disposition, we also mean defensive deletion, the actual electronic information asset being destroyed, right? So we have these platforms going around where you can have archiving functions inherent in them, but they don't offer true archiving, right? So just to keep that in mind. When I talk about records and information management, it is looking at the management of the asset along a management path. We tend to think of records management here in the public service as as a very almost clerical-based function, but it's not. There has to be some inclusion in terms of policy development around records. The reporting level of the person in charge of a records management program is very important. You're as successful as that person in terms of ensuring that the accountable officer, who is the permanent secretary or the head of the department, will be looking at something that is trustworthy. You want to ensure that there is some discipline around it in terms of the information that ends up being managed by those persons. So non-records, for example, would be something that the records information management professional would be looking out for to ensure that you don't end up with noise. And of course, information governance is this new buzzword, but it's always been there. There has to be a compliance framework in place. There has to be some accountability. So somebody needs to be in charge of the information management system, the architecture. There has to be somebody that will take the responsibility in terms of signing off on things. It's not supposed to be a one-man operation in terms of disposition. So you have a committee. There has to be somebody that is responsible for ensuring that the policies in terms of information and records management is available to all persons. There has to be access right throughout the life cycle of the information asset. So if for any reason you decide to transition from one format to another format, the asset should still remain accessible. We all know the issues with obsolescence. I've seen proprietary formats that end up not being accessible once the vendor goes out of business. You don't want to find yourself in that kind of situation. So your records manager has to be somebody that is au fait with what's happening in the industry. I think maybe 5 years ago, the scenario that we're confronted with right now, working from home, would not be something that we would even fathom. Working from home, accessing government information, being able to have access to critical resources on your PDA or your mobile device. These are things that you have to keep in mind, ensuring that you think about the content and not the platform so much. The platform should be able to manage the asset. So it's the asset that's key. When I talk about MDA, I'm speaking predominantly about central government within the context of this conversation. So I know that executive agencies would have their own arrangements. Most of these entities would have already transitioned or would have acquired some platform on-premise to manage their information asset. But on the odd chance that they're not in possession of such solutions, I'm hoping that the conversation would guide them towards the selection of same. And when we talk about, when we start this whole conversation about records and information management, again, going back to the reality of 2-3 years ago, there are countries, Jamaica has a Freedom of Information Act, but there are countries without such legislation in place. Because of COVID-19, they have to publish the dashboard. They have to share information. The Disaster Risk Management Act brought into sharp focus the need to have collaboration between the civil defense. So you're talking about the police, the military, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the medical facilities having access to trustworthy information. Are you looking at the most updated information? Can you validate it? Is there some authentication process? Because again, it ought not to be that anybody could generate said information. You have to have the reassurance that what you're looking at is trustworthy. It should be good enough to be further conveyed to a higher authority. So, you know, again, painting the example of the COVID-19 dashboard, that goes to PAHO, right? So, well, CARFA in the first instance, then PAHO. So this is your public health authority. And then it goes on to the WHO in turn. So just want to keep those things in mind. But we've had this type of scenario before the whole conversation became kosher, where cloud computing has been with us before. We're venturing into social media as well, right? There are some MDAs with information on social media platforms. Now, we're not like the United States, where you have the Public Records Act 1967, where every single administration has to curate and collect information from the administration, and then that information becomes reposed in a presidential library. We don't have that yet. But if you've been tracking what's been happening in the United States, for example, it becomes very important. It is subject to discovery. Now, our legislative framework does not currently include those kinds of considerations, but that's not to say that that's not something that Cabinet may consider down the road, right? But you think about the arrangements that need to be in place for that kind of preparation, you know, by the persons within the MDA's responsible for records keeping, right? It's a lot, but we've done it before. I remember when we were looking at freedom of information coming to the government in Jamaica. I remember the reclassification exercise back in, I think, 1997, 98, where we had the PIDG series being established. We were able to do that then under very extreme pressures. But just to say that these are things that we have to start, you know, to consider. We have to start pondering those things ahead of being forced into a scenario where we're compelled to then do it, right? So in terms of the advantages of the cloud, in the very first instance, collaboration is possible. You can remain at home and you can work on a document asynchronously with a colleague with the reassurance that the asset that you're looking at is the one true original information asset. It is resident in digital format, right? But you have the reassurance, depending on your platform, if it's robust enough, that you're looking at the same document. There are several solutions out there, right? But I'm sure most of you will be familiar with SharePoint or even Teams, where you can have access to that one document where you can check out the asset and work on the asset. You can use DocuSign and sign that asset, and then that would conclude a transaction that is 100% remote, almost, right? We've had, in my previous role back in Barbados, We have the police certificate of character process, which is completely remote. It is completely remote because you can't go into the office, right? So outside of where you would have appeared in a registry as a felonist, that process is completely online. So you don't need to queue up. You can request and apply for a passport online, right? Collaboration. How are you doing these things remotely? The example of having to do the genealogical research, right, would be facilitated in a remote setting if you're using the cloud. But the thing is, before it gets to that stage where you're accessing the asset, there has to be processes set up in terms of ingestion. How do things appear in the cloud? How do they get there? There has to be a robust enough registration process where the information asset has to be formally registered on the platform with the full reassurance that you're observing some set established process. You also need to have considerations as well in terms of who should have said access. So you look at rights management and such things. The cost, again, goes without saying. Instead of having access to a completely on-premise solution, you have plurality, right? That asset is something that transitions way outside of Jamaica. So if you have a colleague on mission travel, it does not prohibit that person from using a VPN and tapping into the cloud and accessing trustworthy information, right? So it's driven down the cost. I remember seeing proposals from vendors before, maybe 10 years ago. They were so expensive. And then you have to do the whole licensing, and then you have to do versions and updates, right? And support would have been normally, outside of the jurisdiction. I would have required flying in the expert to troubleshoot and those things because it's completely on premise. In the cloud, you can have remote support, right? Deployment. Typically, cloud deployment is faster than an on-premise type of scenario, but deployment has to be something that has to be deliberate. When I say deliberate, it should ideally include co-creation. So the provider or the vendor should sit with the client and define the requirements. Oftentimes, we end up trying to purchase a platform that is ill-suited to our realities. The Ministry of Health in another state is completely different than the Ministry of Health here in this country because there are different governance arrangements, there are different operational requirements, and of course, there are different legislation, right, in terms of what is required for compliance. So deployment, still faster than an on-premise type of scenario where you have to sit down and upload, on the server, the drivers and such. But deployment should be a deliberate process. Now, in terms of access and availability, again, going back to the 24/7 access that will be afforded to users that are remote. So you're in another country, you should be able to access, for example, publicly offered services by the government of Jamaica, right? If it is that you have to pay a subscription to access, you still can enjoy access once you pay that subscription, right? So there's an opportunity for government to make money in terms of some of the publicly available services and offering them remotely. Tax administration, there are a number of services that are online. You recall the days when you had to queue up in the line and to benefit from those kind of services. An entire day lost. That's the country not being productive, right? What if you can do the same transaction remotely on a Sunday evening, late at night when you're home from work? So the cloud makes all of these things possible. Federated records management, it does not mean that you have to give up your the platforms that you already subscribe to. Federated records management basically supports in-place records management. So all the various platforms that are within your MDA, the federated records management just allows for the search to be done on those repositories, right? Usually it's through an API, but you can have indices created. And if we're all describing, and going back to the records management fundamentals now, if we are classifying and registering information assets across government from a standardized manner, there is no reason why we can't find the asset. The thing is that there are too many systems at play, right? There are diverse systems because solutions have to be found, and some of those solutions are set in time. There are additional requirements now, for example, for some government information assets. The reality before 9/11 was that most things would have been free, most things would have been accessible. Once you can validate yourself, you provide your ID, you can find certain information. After 9/11, we ended up in a scenario where there was more monitoring, public monitoring. So take, for example, in a discovery scenario where CCTV footage is being used in a court case, or an MDA has to defend itself against some kind of complaint. Say somebody slipped and fell outside of a ministry. CCTV footage from the ministry or across the road. Can you trust that? Is there any standard in place for the calibration of those platforms? Is there any recording? What's the retention on those information assets, those types of feeds? Are there standards in place for different types of formats? Is there a requirement in terms of what would be considered to be archival information assets coming across from government? Because the records that we're creating right now, working on Teams, wherever, these are all potentially archival information assets. What's on your BlackBerry, well, maybe not BlackBerry, but what's on your iPhone? Is it discoverable? Are you saving government information outside of the formal system? Right, so those things, those are questions that need to be addressed, and these all fall under the umbrella of federated records management. Is the discovery of it. Records management supports having access to complete, trustworthy information through time. You remember DBase4 records, Lotus 123 records, right? Still important. Some of those assets are still under retention. The retention has not reached a maturity stage yet. Can you find them? Can you use them? And going back to the example of, God forbid, having the archives burned down. If you have the surrogates in the cloud, the assets will still be able to be utilized. But then you need to have redundancies in terms of having the assurance that the assets can be trusted. I know I'm pressed for time. So what are the risks? Well, obviously, there are information security risks, right? Rights management can manage that, but when you're off-premise and on your own device at home, somebody could be over your shoulder, somebody could download stuff, except that the cloud platform should support reassurances by not permitting the asset to be downloaded, not permitting that asset to be printed. So in some respect, even though it's a risk, it actually does offer more protection than somebody walking into a registry. I've seen registries without locks, which ought not to be, right? Having somebody walking into where the records are stored in your ministry and taking a file, who's monitoring that? What if they don't sign the charge card? This gives you a better reassurance, all right? In terms of the service level agreements, you need to know who your provider is. Do they have, for example, safeguards in terms of their employees? How much access does the IT guy at your service provider have to your information? Are there specific access requirements in terms of accessing your resource? So they should only be storing or managing your resources, but they ought not to have access to it. Where are the servers stored? This becomes important depending on the kind of information that you're managing, right? I don't know how many are aware of the Patriot Act, the former Patriot Act, which was replaced by the USA Freedom Act, which basically allowed the United States government to basically request that ISPs who who manage most of these cloud infrastructure, they will be required to hand over servers if there's a discovery request from the government of the United States, right? Spare a thought for that. So where are the servers being kept in terms of government's information, right? So sovereignty, data sovereignty is a big issue. It's not something that most records managers talk about, but we are affected, right? Privacy and personal data goes without saying. We have a brand new Data Protection Act, which dictates the scenarios where information ought to be collected from data subjects and what's required in terms of the collectors or the data owners. So ministries, departments, agencies collect information because you're in the business of running the government. But then what are the safeguards in terms of ensuring that the data collected will be properly retired, properly treated, etc. I personally hate, and I've not experienced this in Jamaica, I must signal, but I remember when the pandemic was in the early stages where they had a book, because contact tracing was a requirement. And they had this big book where you're required to sign with your name, with your address, and some contact information. And that was for everybody to see. In small societies, that's not a good thing because you're breaching the privacy of the person in front of you. And in scenarios where you have, restraining orders or stalking, if you want to know where somebody is, assuming that they're giving the correct information, you can find all of that out by tracking the stores that they go, because that's a requirement under the DRMA. Well, maybe not the DRMA, but the legislation in the applicable jurisdiction. So how we treat information is very important. The data collector is very important, that they're properly trained in terms of capturing that information, how they treat with it, how do they get rid of it. I've seen stores throw away that same book, just throw it in the trash bin. That's not proper. So it's good to look at global standards such as the General Data Protection Requirement from the European Union, which seems very far away, but which we're impacted by because we have European nationals here in this country. How many persons are aware that you can be penalized for not treating properly with personal data or personally identifiable information of European nationals? The government is by default one of the biggest handlers of personal data. It goes without saying. How is that data being retired? Has anyone been doing the research to see if there's some kind of compliance framework in place for how information, personal identifiable information is treated within the MDAs? I know that the Information Commissioner is a brand new appointment, so I would like to, to find out some more about the arrangements that might be considered at this stage in terms of personal data. We spoke about data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is very important. You can't be storing information that impacts national security, for example, or how your the machinery, the core machinery of government works. So, for example, cabinet papers and those high-level documents. You have a service provider. Where are the servers being stored? Right? Where is that information physically being kept? Because there's a back office process to it. What's happening with that? Where are the original assets? Right? Is there a hybrid system? Right? Electronic discovery, which I just mentioned, about having to do research into a complaint, right? You have to ensure that you're able to find the related information asset. So the assets might be, for example, in digital and physical format. Do you know where they are? So we get caught up in this whole concern about digitization, where you scan, digitize asset. And by the way, scanning and digitization are two different discrete things. When you scan something, you have just made an image. When you digitize, you have annotated metadata included. So even in terms of capture, you should know which operator, what machine scanned this asset, and where does the original sit. What are the retention requirements around it? What is access around it? So we don't currently have classification in terms of access, right? So like those things, unclassified, declassification process across government as we get more digitized. So there has to be a process where, for example, since I think Parliament is streamed, it goes by default that everything in Parliament is publicly accessible, but then the Hansard now is a different thing, right? Whereas so you have different and discrete treatment in terms of information asset. Do you have a declassification process? So after X amount of years, this becomes publicly accessible. That's supporting the Access to Information Act. And we also don't practice redacting. There's nothing prohibiting the release of the asset if we redact. You suppress those details that might reveal PIIs, and might reveal information that the government has that wants to keep as privileged information, which is going to impact national security, international relations, etc. Right? But you release the asset. That's you complying 100% with requests. Right? That's a big deal with the multilaterals. In terms of ransomware, we have not, to the best of my knowledge, been victims of that, but that's something to keep in mind. That's ensuring that your information security team would have people at the ready to do penetration testing of the cloud platforms, right? The cloud infrastructure. So that actually affects us as records managers because we, in some cases, would be the backup, right? You remember after 9/11, seeing all of that paper floating around. Imagine a similar scenario now, except that you have, in addition to the paper, infrastructure, computing infrastructure. Is it that, do we have backups? Do we have mirror servers and those kind of redundancies to ensure that all those assets that would have been converted into digital format are still accessible, right? So all those things, business continuity planning and such. And this is just giving you just an idea in terms of the cloud service models. I know I'm pressed for time. But consider this. There are several, and in some cases competing, initiatives across government where under Ministry A's mandate, you're obligated to provide these services to government, and then Ministry B has a differentiated mandate, but you're all part of GOG. But what if there's a solution already in place in Ministry A? Should it not be then that the existence of that platform be made public, well, maybe not public, but at least within the machinery of government, where Ministry B could benefit from that, whereas the stock taking in terms of procurement, and for the records managers now, who oftentimes are left out of that procurement process, right? Who needs to, in some instances, you need to hold their hands and help them to structure the requirements. What if there was a body in place to look at cloud solutions? We know that under the records management procurement, we would have the DoD 5015.2 platform to look at as a standard in terms of procurement of RIM solutions, right? But what about archival solutions? So there should be something equivalent in terms of having something that's always compliant. So that's the Open Archival Information System, which is an ISO standard, ensuring that you comply with that. There are basic metrics that could be met in terms of the vendor being able to demonstrate that they can provide these functionalities on the platform, right? And also, just to remind those listening in that we do have a local ISO 15489 standard, which is the International Records Management Standard. Jamaica was the first CARICOM country to establish a national standard for records management. Where is the compliance with that? So I think that vendors need to prove compliance with these frameworks before procurement goes ahead in terms of these solutions. Most of these solutions are also looking at providing enterprise content management functionalities and electronic document or records management functionalities, but there are standards that are in place already in the industry that we can look at, and I believe that eGov Jamaica, which already has the mandate to look at solutions across government, should be involved and should do it collaboratively with JARD, because that's where everything ends up. Everything ends up. All that we're doing right now, all the work that's been done at the different levels of government, they end up at JARD for permanent preservation. Can you give the reassurance that the information asset, the digital information asset, will be accessible 5 years down the road, given the pace at which the IT industry moves at? They're moving at lightning speed, right? Also looking at the provision of cloud infrastructure services. And when I talk about cloud infrastructure services, we have websites. Almost every single ministry has web presence. But then we don't have standards in terms of the layout. You know, if you go to a Government of Canada website, it looks the same layout and everything. So in the same way you want to search for information, providing an easier conduit for accessing government information, there should be at least some agreement across MDAs where the search window for public, having access to the cloud platform to search for records that are outside, within the scope for release under the Access to Information Act should be. So that window, that search window, again using federated search, could be at the top right corner for argument's sake, right? This also would, I think, sync with the ambitions of the blueprint, the IT blueprint from MSET, in terms of supporting the IT governance framework. It should really be hosted by eGov Jamaica. And again, I can't pronounce upon what ought to be, but is a recommendation, because it gives a reassurance that, guess what, certain safeguards would already be met. That is their mandate. If we build out that same infrastructure, we can search across MDAs. So looking for information on a particular subject, it can get as granular as you want or as wide as you want, right? So if it's all accessible on the gov.jm handle, for example, everything should be on the same platform. That's having access to linked repositories, right? Also, looking at information governance. So bearing in mind that the infrastructure and the technology will already be out there, but the information asset is what should be the area of concern. Where is the information governance around your assets, right? If we have a digital surrogate or a native digital asset and it sits in the cloud, are you fully executing disposition? So are you then able to sit at home? We're all working from home. Can you, delete an asset and have the reassurance that it's deleted? Can you truly archive the asset? So these are things that, you have to be able to support in terms of information governance. And then in terms of the, being agnostic in terms of the technology. Forget about the format. Forget about the platforms. Only ensure that the platforms and the formats will support access and the reassurance that you can trust the asset through time. That should be the concern. Vendors will come and sell you stuff, but can it meet your functional requirements? Having some adherence to standards in terms of final formats and what should be in place in terms of registration on the platforms are very important, right? But it should allow for what we call heterogeneous ingestion, so different formats. The formats in terms of the records being kept at the NLA, for argument's sake, and other departments that will deal with specific information, the Med Service, for example, right? GIS records and such. These records should have some reassurance in terms of how they should be treated, irrespective of the format that they have, the fact that they have different formats, for example, right? So these are things that need to be kept in mind. Compliance and best practices, we need to build our own things. There are global standards that we can drill down from and get more specific so that everybody will be on the same page in terms of what is required as a best practice. How records are supposed to be maintained in government, best practice approach. You know, there's so many things that you can put down in terms of prescriptive treatment. Right. So I know I'm out of time, so I look forward to your feedback, and I just want to signal that these types of encounters, these types of conversations, you know, there is no end to where it can go. I think that what is important is to keep certain things in view. There are concerns that stretch across not just RIM, but might impact, for example, the museum community. And I've always believed that archives, library to an extent, information management, records management, and museum practitioners should have an opportunity to come together, because we're all right now invested in ensuring that information assets that pertain to our country will be accessible for the generations to come, right? So I thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Emerson Bryan, for a wide-ranging presentation. Of course, giving the advantages and disadvantages of cloud storage or cloud computing, and giving us some things to consider as we move forward. Now, we're going to invite at this time our acting principal director in the Information Division of the Office of the Prime Minister to come to do the vote of thanks. And immediately following that, we will have the official launch, and we crave your indulgence because we will get into our public forum immediately following. So, Mr. Cox, will you come forward, please, and make him welcome.
Good morning again, everyone online and also those present. Thank you to our great Master of Ceremonies so far. I think she's led us ably well through the proceedings. And I know the Minister will permit me in saying that she's done such a wonderful job, and that we look forward to your continued guidance through the public forum session. Thank you to the Minister, who ably laid the foundation for us in terms of looking at the entire information portfolio and the importance of records and information management within that portfolio, and how we need to preserve all records, not just for the purposes of public authorities, but for the purposes of the nation as a whole, and for reminding us that the future of our archives is the future of our data, and about the initiatives mentioned by the Most Honorable Prime Minister in terms of G-data. And within the context of our celebrating 60 years of independence this year, that it's important for us to create systems that are climate resilient, that are fit for purpose, that meets our technical and technology requirements, and that we are focused on pivoting both in terms of the things that have pushed us, let's say, accelerated our transformation initiatives, like the COVID pandemic, which I will, remind us all still continues, and we're navigating and trying to get back to some level of normalcy. I would like to thank Mrs. Thomas for reminding us during this 60th anniversary year of JARD that it's important, the activities that are being undertaken through the RIM program as part of the project to implement the GOJ RIM policy, as we seek to transform information and records management and bridge the gap. And I thank Mrs. Thomas for mentioning all the work that has been, or some of the work that's been undertaken with cohorts 1, 2, and 3, and how we look to move forward as we soon will be looking to add cohort 4 as we look to strengthen records and information management within the public sector. Thank you to Mr. Thompson, who is a critical partner through the Cabinet Office in terms of driving the RING program and the project. And I thank him for reminding us of the value of our RIM practitioners and how important they are to deliver on the services that we want to deliver for, ultimately, for the members of the public. What we do in terms of transforming RIM is not about our own functions and operations as public entities. Ultimately, these improving RIM helps us to make better decisions, helps us to be more responsible and more accountable, but they also ultimately must redound to the benefit of the ultimate consumer, ultimate customer, which is the people of Jamaica. Thank you to our able keynote speaker who mentioned and guided us through the disadvantages and advantages of cloud services. He was very comprehensive in speaking about data protection issues, privacy issues, cybersecurity concerns, the interrelation of all these areas to the RIM management program, the importance of accountability, trust in that program, vendor management, redundancy, the risks that we have to account for, being technology agnostic, and to ensure that the mandates that are required to be upheld and the standards that need to be met in terms of international ISO standards are met. And we thank him for this comprehensive presentation. And we look forward to further discussions with him on his presentation. I want to ask you to give special commendation to our powerful young ladies from St. Thomas. They gave a wonderful performance, reminding us of how strong and resilient and powerful we need to be, reminding us of our national spirit, and that perseverance and resilience is so important. And we can take note that this perseverance and resilience is something that we have to infuse in our delivery of the RIM program, and as we go forward in strengthening records and information management across government. And I want to thank, again, those of us in public and private sector who are participating here and online, and ask that you continue to join us as we go forward into the public forum. So, in this official launch of RIM Month activities for 2022, I want to thank all of the persons in the JAR team, led by Mrs. Thomas, for putting together this wonderful event, which is important as we kick off strongly this month of activities, and as a team that we'll be working strongly together and well together to ensure that we have success to deliver for the Jamaican people what they so genuinely want in terms of improving our service excellence across all areas, and in particular in terms of records and information management, which, if this is not strong as the first step in the process, it impacts a lot of other areas in terms of information accessibility and in terms of preservation of our national assets. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. All right, I'm going to remain seated because I believe at this time I'm going to hand over to the Minister to do the official launch of RIM Month activities. And just to let you know that on the 20th, there'll be an online records management training and appraisal and disposition. On the 27th, there will be training in project management for RIM professionals. And of course, you heard earlier on, Mrs. Thomas mentioned the virtual tours of JARD that will be available. And there, is it the RIMZIM magazine? RIMZine, all right, the RIMZine magazine. All right, we're rhyming there, which will be also published in this month of activities. So, Minister, over to you for the official launch of RIM Month of activities.
Thank you very much, Marlene, Stevenson, Dali. And thanks to everyone who came out today. I think we had a wonderful presentation by our guest speaker, and I think that it is likely that members of the public who are listening now have a better understanding. I want to officially launch the Records and Information Month. I guess that's how I do it, right, Marlene? Yes, she just articulated some of the activities, very important activities. So I would love if everyone here and everyone who is listening spread the word about some of the wonderful things that we're doing so that as many people can participate as possible. So officially, Mr. Cox, we're now in RIM Month. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
So we can make some noise for that, you know. All right. Thank you very, very much, Minister, and thank you for your contribution. And we know that there's a lot of work ahead, and you are up to the task. All right, ladies and gentlemen who are with us here at the Talk of the Town and those persons who are online, we're going to get into our public forum at this time. I believe we have two panelists, or at least one panelist, who will join us here, and then we have two panelists who will be online. Allow me to take a moment to introduce our panelists as we do some movements. Okay, I'm going to move across. All right, let me just move across, not without my pen. All right, I'm coming a little closer to you, Minister. And I know we'll have to excuse you in a little bit because you do have a live interview to be done on RGR 94. And we quite understand. But let me just introduce you to our panelists for this segment of the program. We have Dwaymian Brissett, and he is currently employed at the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court. He's based in Castries in St. Lucia as the Information Services and Communications Manager since March 2016. Dwaymian holds a master's and a bachelor's in library and information studies with a minor in human resource development and certificates in management studies and supervisory management, all from the University of the West Indies. He is also a graduate of Monash University in Australia with a graduate diploma in information and knowledge management, an MBA from the University of South Wales, and an LLB from the University of London. Dwaymian was also awarded professional certificates in leadership and strategic management, human resource management, project management, and financial management, and a certificate of merit in advanced leadership from Texas A&M University. Professionally, Dwaymian is the immediate past president of the Caribbean Association of Law Librarians, that's CAROL, and a former vice president of CAROL, and holds the distinction of being the first chair of the Library and Information Association of Jamaica, Record and Archives Management Section. He currently holds membership in CAROL, IFLA, BIALL, and ILA. So please put your hands together and make Dwaymian welcome. Also joining us on the panel is Tamika Clough, and she assumed duties as Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Registrar General's Department here in Jamaica. She has some 18 years in government service, a first degree in urban and regional planning from UTEC Jamaica, a master's in business administration from the University of New Orleans, certified project management specialist since 2016. She's also a member of the Beta Gamma Sigma, which is an academic honors society for excellence in business administration. Her expertise includes project and program management, policy development, research and analysis, stakeholder engagement, strategic planning, and quality assurance. Please make Ms. Tamika Clough welcome. And we also are joined by Dr. Patrick Anglin, who is the University of the West Indies Data Protection Officer. He has held that position since August 2021. And Dr. Anglin has a long-standing career with the UWI, which started in 1996. He started as a computer programmer in the Office of the Board for Undergraduate Studies, and subsequently advanced to serve in the Office of Administration and Special Initiatives, the Office of Administration, and most recently, the Office of the University Chief Information Officer. He is also an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Computing at the Mona campus and a former course coordinator of Information Technology at the School of Continuing Studies, which later, along with other units, formed the UWI's Open Campus. Dr. Anglin holds a Doctor of Business Administration, DBA, focusing on innovative systems from the University of Manchester's Manchester Business School in the UK, a Master of Business Administration from the UWI Mona School of Business, a Bachelor of Science in Computer Studies from UWI as well, and his academic and professional background has allowed him to take, or rather make, several contributions to the development of UWI, their information technology policy framework. As the team lead, he has been instrumental in drafting the UWI Data Protection Policy 2019-2020 and has developed the university-wide ICT policy framework, assisted with drafting the university-wide information strategy, drafted the information security policy, very important, and redrafted the UWI social media policy. There are many other things I could tell you about Dr. Anglin, but suffice it to say that in this new role of Data Protection Officer, he has a major responsibility. And I'd like you to also make him welcome. Of course, you know, our minister will be with us and he will be in and out. And we're going to now get into the presentation. We want to start off with you, Minister, just to give us an overview of the information portfolio in the Office of the Prime Minister. And I think we have about 5 minutes per presenter. We're trying to tighten the activities here. So, Minister, you want to start for us?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marlene. So the information portfolio has both, I call it, executing entities and regulatory entities. So executing entities could be like Jamaica Information Service, Public Broadcasting Corporation, Jamaica Archives and Records Unit, while regulating entities would be like the Broadcast Commission of Jamaica that governs free-to-air television and radio in Jamaica. They're also deep in the process of formulating and managing the digital switchover, which commenced in January of this year, which is basically transferring Jamaica's free-to-air television space from an analog space into a digital space. What that means is that you will now have more channels. You'll now be able to transfer data through this system. You'll be able to provide more services to persons, especially in rural areas who don't have cable, and so on. We also have, as I mentioned before, Public Broadcasting Corporation, which its responsibility is to publicly give public information in terms of culture, entertainment, and so on. We've had some challenges with it over the period. For example, it's not free to air, it's only on cable, which means that a majority of Jamaicans do not have access to it. So technically, it's not fulfilling that aspect of its mandate of being a public broadcaster. That is something that we take very seriously. The Prime Minister does take it very seriously, and we're seeking to transform it into a proper public broadcaster. Also, Jamaica Information Service, which is the main communications arm for government actions and policies, that is also going through a transformation, stronger collaboration with PBCJ, such as providing content. They recently signed an MOU since I became minister with PBCJ to provide content. The Prime Minister also announced that we're going to bring over Cool FM to PBCJ because PBCJ does not have a radio station. It's the most fascinating thing when you think about it, that the government does not have either publicly viewable television station or radio station. It's a strange evolution, but it's something that we're changing. So we're not going to mess too much with the aeronautical broadcast of Cool FM, because we think that's also important. Even though most people are getting it from the internet now, we still think that's an aspect. But Cool FM, which is a government-owned entity, where the Prime Minister has announced transferring of it to PBCJ, as well as JIS providing more content to PBCJ and making PBCJ publicly accessible to greater members, to more members of the public. The other side of it, which is JARD and Archives and Records Unit, that's a big deal for us, because with the advent of NIDS, the management of data, creating a proper data security infrastructure that deals with our archival material, deals with the material that is at our museums, deals with the historical records that are so important. We're creating a framework, a new policy as it relates to the creation of data centers, the management of data. And a big part of that as well is the digitization of our documents. We have documents there that are many decades old, and paper does not last forever. So unless we urgently start digitizing a lot of our official documents, because the more you handle, and our national archivists will tell you, every time you handle a document, you degrade it. Whether it be exposing it to air, whether it be the oil from your skin, whether it be minerals that you're exposing it to, you degrade it. So the more you touch these documents, the more you interact with them, is the shorter their lifespan. And those are some of the considerations which digitization will help. You don't have to touch a document to get the information from it. And we'll be working with Mr. Cox and the entire team from JARD and RIM and the Public Sector Transformation Unit to really speed up that digitization process. We also want to speak about access to information, which is a big deal, and I save it for last because I didn't necessarily want to touch it, but I will. The reform of the Access to Information Act is long overdue. The Joint Select Committee met in 2009, I believe it was. That was when the meeting started, or the decision was made to reform. And then in 2011, they tabled their report. That was 10 years ago. And nothing has happened since. We have agreed as a government to the open government approach through the Ministry of Finance and through various, the Public Sector Transformation Unit, that have given us some static timelines in terms of reforming the Access to Information Act, making it more, not just the Access to Information Act, but also the Official Secrets Act and so on, to make it more accessible. So we as a government believe in open government, we believe in information, but the reality is that the Act does not, as it is, reflect the modern approach to the access to information. Of course, there are things that the government cannot reveal in the instance, but a majority of information that is held by the government is not secret information, and it could assist the public to improve their lives. And we believe that the Access to Information Act is a core part of improving confidence in the government, improving governance, and also enhancing the perception that people have of our country and of the government going forward. So generally, there's a lot of heavy lifting to happen over the next 12 to 18 months, Mr. Cox. A lot of work to be done, a lot of things to reform and transform. But I think we have the support, the fact that the Prime Minister has brought information and all of these agencies over to the Office of the Prime Minister gives them some level of prestige and strength to push forward with a lot of these reforms. And I know that the team is quite committed and ready. I've met with them on several occasions, and they have expressed commitment and a drive to get things done. So that is my overview. Thank you, Marlene.
Thank you very much, Minister. Transforming information and records management, bridging the gap. We are at least identifying those gaps, and we'll have to work to bridging those gaps. Minister, would you like to exit for your interview at this time? Oh, yes, we will allow you to take leave of us. All right. And then we're going to invite Mr. Dwayne Brissett, Information Services and Communications Manager, Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court, Castries, St. Lucia. We introduced him earlier on, and I believe he is online. Good howdy do from Jamaica.
Howdy do, Marlene. How are you?
I am well, thank you. How are you doing? Great to have you. Laws and regulations governing the management of records in the digital age. I believe that is what you're going to talk to us a little bit about this morning.
Yes, I am.
Go right ahead.
Okay. So I just want to adopt the protocol that was established by our able Master of Ceremonies. Save and accept to especially welcome our government archivists, our keynote speaker, Mr. Emerson Bryan, and the minister who have just left. I want to put that on record. Well, records management. I don't see how records management can exist without laws, because that's how, as a records manager, you get to compliance. But before that, let me share a little with you guys, and in the question and answer segment, you can ask me and I can divulge more. So records created digitally, just like paper records, are subjected to specific laws and regulations that records management professionals must understand and comply with, including general laws relating to records and specific laws relating to electronic records. Your understanding of existing laws is therefore crucial as you begin to develop your electronic records management strategy. Another thing that I normally tell individuals and persons when I do give these talks is to make sure that you have a very good physical records management system in place before you try to have a digital records management system, save and except for records that were born digitally. Laws and regulation governing records management practices in the digital era are vital, as it helps records management professionals in creating records management policies and procedures that are grounded in the laws of the land. Records management policies and procedures that are referred to legislation make compliance within organization much easier, and the sanctions that are provided for in individual pieces of legislation for breaches can be easily adopted in your RIM policy. Data gleaned from IDB and World Bank statistics shows that countries which have legislation governing records management practices, especially in the digital age, are doing much better and have higher GDPs and are in line to achieve their SDGs as per the UN 2030 agenda. It is my fervent hope that my country, Jamaica, will create and promulgate laws which help to facilitate the use of information technology in government and businesses by addressing the legal obstacles that exist in a system that was predominantly created for physical records and physical signature. The pandemic over the last 2 years has caused governments and businesses to be very creative in making sure that business continuity remains possible. However, please be mindful that the records that were created during the pandemic are official records and should be harnessed and stored accordingly. Just like my Chief Justice normally, when she gives a talk, always say that while everything else could have been quarantined during the pandemic, justice cannot be quarantined. And just the same with your records management programs. Once business continuity and government continuity continues, we will be developing and creating records. Just make sure that we're saving them, not on our personal drives, but on network drives so that they can be properly harnessed. And these are things that are supposed to be written in records management policies, and sanctions should be applied where they are contravened. In the Caribbean, many government agencies and businesses are managing their records management programs using policies and procedures that are in most instances adopted from global records management laws. Some examples of these laws are the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR coming out of the European Union, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act from the US, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, among others. Regionally, the trade arrangements under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, the Treaty of Bastille, and at the local level, Access to Information Act, the well overdue Amendment Archive Act, our Labor Laws, Company Act, and our recently Disaster Risk Management Act. However, though we are not where we want to be as yet, I am encouraged by the Electronic Transaction Act of 2020 and would like to see the Archive Act amended to reflect the digital era and how digital records ought to be archived, and the Data Protection Act of 2020 operationalized, so that RIM professionals can update their RIM policies to include provisions from these pieces of legislation. And I've gone through them comprehensively, and I'm very encouraged with the Data Protection Act and also the Electronic Transaction Act. So when the Archive Act and the Access to Information Act are amended accordingly, I hope they take into consideration provisions that are provided for under those two pieces of legislation I've mentioned before. Additionally, there are other legislation in Jamaica that make mention of records. I would love for our Archive Act to be amended to be one that is more comprehensive and truly one that represents a 21st century country that is operating and trying to achieve our 2030 SDGs. So since we have not rushed it yet, I would want us to take our time in making sure that each provisions are properly crafted. So when the Chief Parliamentary Council get drafting instructions, we'll have a very comprehensive Archive Act to take us beyond our 60th anniversary and beyond. The primary purpose of having your digital records management programs and policies grounded in law is so that if the court have to determine the validity of an electronic record or signature, the court will be in a place to do so based on the laws that exist in the land and your individual records management policy within your organization. Some examples that the court may rule that an agency or a business operating are creating, using, and managing records in an untrustworthy system or manner. One indicator of untrustworthiness would be an agency failure to follow the laws governing electronic records or transaction. In the case of Jamaica, the provision as provided for in the Electronic Transaction Act. In closing, I want to impress upon records manager, when developing records management policies and procedures, you should always make sure that they are developed. We are developing a program that is very inclusive and one that has an emphasis on access and privacy, while at the same time not breaching any human rights laws. The digital era is an exciting one. However, it comes with its challenges, and as such, records managers will always have to try as best as possible to bridge the gaps using the current legal framework that you have as your guide. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Dwayne Brissett, for your contribution this morning. A number of legislations cited there, or labor laws, Access to Information Act, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Health Insurance, the Electronic Transaction Act, Data Protection Act. There's a lot of law behind all of this, and I would imagine that our professionals need to do a lot of homework, yes, to be grounded in this law. But of course, inclusivity, access, privacy, and all of those things are considerations as well. Thank you once again, Mr. Brissett, and we're going to ask persons to hold their questions. Please make a note of them, because we will take them once we have gone through all of the presentations, and I know we will be able to get some answers for you as well. I already have some questions which have come in. So now we're going to move to Ms. Tamika Clough, and she's the Director Operations Management Division and the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for the Registrar General's Department, a very, very important department in our history. And Ms. Clough, over to you.
Thank you so much, Masters of Ceremony. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. As a representative here today, I think it's a privilege to celebrate with you today in your 60th anniversary, in our 60th year of independence. That's a great thing. So most of you might know RGD as the place where your birth certificate. But we are the agency that follows you through every milestone of your life. You would think it's the tax department, but it's not. It's RGD that follows you through every vital milestone of your life. And we talk about milestones, and for us at RGD, that includes birth, marriage, death, even stillbirths, adoption, deed poll, wills, powers of attorney, you name it. Your birth, death, stillbirths, and marriage are referred as vital events, and once these events are registered, a record is made and held in our repository. So now, whilst we have physical, tangible registrations of all events that occur in Jamaica, consider that we also have these registrations in electronic format as well, mostly for births, deaths, and marriages. We have had these capabilities since 2001, which facilitates the generation of printed certificates, the one you may know on the security paper, versus a copy of the handwritten record that was previously issued. So to carry out the business of the RGD, an effective management system has to be in place for both methods of storing our vital events. Records management is therefore the area of general administrative management concerned with achieving economic and efficiency in the creation, maintenance, and use of the records. For our vital records stored in hard copy, we have about 7 million originals stored in our vaults. We have a main vault, we have a death vault, we have an IRO vault, while the duplicates are stored in a separate facility, and we call that the armory. All vital records are stored in a climate control environment to ensure retention life. And originals are stored in acid-free boxes to prevent damage from acids, dust, UV lights, and pests. In planning for hazards such as fires, a fire suppression system utilizing a powder is utilized in storage areas. And as you may be familiar, the acid-free boxes with the records are stored on shelves, not in cabinets, and filed using alphanumeric system. Even with all the precautions used to store records, some of our records, particularly the long ones, anybody in here born before 1957? No? Good. So the ones before that used to be in the long form. You may be familiar with the short form. Birth record? Yes. So those tend to deteriorate, and so we have to preserve them or even recreate them to ensure their longevity. So for our vital records stored in electronic format, the RGD now has approximately 2.6 million vital records scanned and indexed. And I think as the keynote speaker mentioned earlier, there is a difference between scanned and digitized. So we have 2.6 million vital records scanned and indexed. And this data is stored in our image database. And we also have 3.3 million digitized in our production database. Both facilitate the easy retrieval of records when we are processing applications. So the agency will continue to expand the scanning and digitization of the remaining records. I mentioned 7 million earlier, right? So we have 2.6 scanned and we have 3.3 digitized. So we will continue to scan and digitize the remaining records through the help of the National Identification System project. Everybody know it as NIDS. And the digitization aspect of the project will focus in the first instance on birth records. The effective management of our vital records helps us to properly and adequately document the performance of the agency's functions, which is to ensure the safekeeping of all records in the legal custody of the keeper of the records and for the convenient transaction of the business of the RGD. It also promotes administrative efficiencies and facilitates the agency being in compliance with over 30 pieces of legislation that we administer. In addition, the effective management of our vital records facilitates the development of our products and services, such as our genealogy research service, where you can discover your family origin, discover new family members, and discover your heritage. A genealogy research can also provide you with the ancestral cause of death that can identify illnesses that you are predisposed to. So we have a product called an ancestral cause of death tree, like a family tree, and it plots all your family members and what major illnesses they would have died from so that you can identify what you may be predisposed to. So we also offer a service where you can check our marriage repository to determine if the person you are dating isn't already married. This is known as the no impediment search. So ladies, this is a very good product to utilize. Gentlemen, any unmarried person can utilize this service. The best complement to our vital events list would be divorce decrees, where we could close the circle on the vital events, and plans are already underway to make this a reality. So I hope I've opened your eyes to how we manage our vital records and invite you to visit us to see our operations. Maybe look at our records, look at some famous persons such as Sir Alexander Bustamante, who, as you know, his surname is Clark, but he did a deed poll to change his name to Bustamante. And maybe you can come and walk through one of our vaults, even the death vault. You won't die. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Ms. Tamika Clough. Wow. Ladies, the no impediment search, that sounds like something that you should know about if you're contemplating marriage. And gentlemen, I will not be biased here today. And gentlemen, thank you so much. Quite a bit of information there that I'm sure will be an eye-opener for many persons. All right, we have one final presenter, and then we're going to take your questions. We have Dr. Patrick Anglin, University Data Protection Officer from the University of the West Indies. And I believe Dr. Anglin is also joining us virtually. Is Dr. Anglin on at this time?
I am on, Marlene.
Oh, hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome. You're going to be talking to us about implications of Jamaica's data protection legislation on operations and records management. So over to you.
Thank you, Marlene. Good afternoon, everyone. The protocols have already been observed, and I just want to say special thanks to Mrs. Claudette Thomas for inviting me to this very, very important public forum. And I wish you all the best for the rest of RIM month. So let's jump in very quickly. I hope you can actually see my presentation screen.
Yes, we can see.
I won't stay long in terms of this presentation. I have quite a number of slides, but I will run through them fairly quickly. So the perspectives that I will share are those from a large organization such as the University of the West Indies. And our organization, as much of you know, spans quite a bit of the globe. And specifically for the Caribbean, we operate in 17 countries. So we have contributing territories across the entire Caribbean, the Anglophone Caribbean. And of those 17 countries, 10 of them have legislation specific to data protection. And that is the context that I am going to be speaking on, data protection, and not general data in respect of an organization. Now, data protection and personal data really speaks to the kind of information that can be used to identify an individual who is living, or in some jurisdictions, an individual who is living or one who has died less than 30 years ago. So I just want us to understand that context. Now, we at the University of the West Indies not only operate in the Caribbean, but we also have what we refer to as our 10 global centers. So we're a true global organization. So we operate across 27 different jurisdictions. So our job is really to ensure that we protect information across all those jurisdictions, which is a very difficult one to do, because as you would imagine, each of these jurisdictions have their own set of legislations, their own set of regulations, their own standards. So we have to ensure that we keep abreast of what is taking place. So some context also in respect of data protection is that across the world, the landscape has changed. The United Nations has around 193 members. Of that membership, about 130 have put in place, have enacted data privacy or data protection legislation. So there is nowhere to hide in respect of legislation. We have to conform. And as our esteemed moderator said, and I'm quoting her here, as the world turns, we must turn with it. It's important to understand that is our context that we will be speaking about. So what are we talking about? What goes into protecting data? So first, we want to think about very carefully the security part of it. Are you who you say you are in respect of accessing the information? Because the problems, many of the problems that we have really start from access. Are persons able to access the data that they say they should be able to access? And are the persons who are accessing the data really the persons who ought to access the data? So that's one element of it. The second element is controlling that access. So once we have gotten, for example, an authentication list of persons, persons have to now prove who they are. And of course, the third aspect, which is the aspect of focus right now, is that of data protection. And data protection really is about a set of procedures, a set of policies, a set of practices, which is there to prevent disclosure of information. Now, when we say disclosure does not have to be, it doesn't have to be deliberate, because we speak about protecting data in 4 layers. The first layer, the bottommost layer, is that of infrastructure security. And we're not going to delve deeply into this. The second layer is that of data security, which is everybody's responsibility. Infrastructure security is really in the province of the persons who are professionals in that space, the computing people. Of course, the third layer is that of data protection, which is where much of the legislation is going now. And the fourth layer, which is the topmost layer, is that of legal compliance. And there are persons on this panel who are far more qualified than myself to speak to that. So I'm going to leave that alone. But I want us to understand something. All of these layers progressively elaborate on the layer below it. So when we speak about data security, you really build on top of your infrastructure security layer. When we speak about data protection, we build on top of the data security layer. And of course, legal compliance is a part of data protection, and it builds on top of data protection. I want us to understand that clearly. So these are the two layers that really I am focused on now: the data protection layer and the legal compliance layer. Now, there are some principles that we have to think about. And these principles are articulated all across data protection in terms of the landscape. The first one is openness, followed by the limitation of the limitation of collecting information. Then we move to specifying why the information is being collected, then how it's used, how it's secured, whether the information is of quality, meaning that it's correct, it's complete, and it's in the right context. And then we speak about access and correction, and that really has to do with the person to whom the data relates. And finally, the accountability part of it, which comes from the organization's perspective. So these 8 principles are really enshrined across the landscape and have been captured in much of the legislation, including our own data protection legislation in Jamaica. And I want to say again that I am not focused at this moment on the entire institutional data. I am just narrowly focused on personal data. And personal data, by definition, would be any information, either by itself or in conjunction with other information, which can be used to identify an individual who is alive or who has died less than 30 years ago. And there are some terms that are thrown around, terms like data controller, which would be the institution that you give your information to, or the individual that you give your information to. That person or that institution is really responsible for ensuring its confidentiality, because we recognize that persons have a right to privacy, and therefore, when you get information, you have to ensure that it's kept confidential. The core principles that I articulated a while ago, the breaches of these core principles really has some legal ramifications. So the breaches, such as unlawfully obtaining or disclosing information, these can be punished by law, irrespective of whether it's a public body or a private body. And persons who would have been found to be in breach, persons can be prosecuted, organizations can be fined, and persons can also be fined. So I want us to recognize that. And processing means several things: obtaining, recording, collecting, organizing, retrieving, aligning almost all the records management functions really are involved in respect of processing. So there is some amount of commonality between general records management and the dealings which have to do with privacy, identification, classification, security, protection, access. These things transcend both spaces. Many organizations separate the two spaces. So there's a cheat sheet that we can use. We recognize that many places separate the two. Well, the truth of the matter is that there is a regulatory risk, because there is an increased global awareness and global move towards data protection. It means that records management must include data protection in its approach. So therefore, these are two birds: data protection, records management, and these can be killed with the same stone, drawing skills from both places. But the problem, the challenge, is aligning both. So some of the considerations that we had to tackle in our large organization is really understanding, first of all, how to differentiate between the different types of personal data. The personal data and the special category referred to as sensitive personal data. Both of these, though, are a part of the organization's record. Importantly also, it is not just the data which is managed by your day-to-day staff. It's also data which is managed by subcontractors, by part-time staff, or even data that you allow persons to look at, which belongs, quote unquote, to the organization because it has been given to the organization to manage on behalf of individuals referred to as data subjects. So recognize that in large organizations and even small ones, the records manager plays a critical role. It means that everybody must begin to consult the records management professional. Everybody. Now, we have been talking a bit about digital records, but we need to look very closely at both digital and manual records. And data protection covers both digital records, which most of the time would be stored, or all of the time would be stored in an information system of some sort. However, manual data protection is critical because data is data, irrespective of the form it is. So record management's role has really evolved into one where it has to now collaborate with all the functional units across every organization to ensure that all types of data are managed. Many times, persons from the technology space tend to focus very narrowly on data protection for digital records. But I want to make the point, and make the point very strongly, that we're not just talking about digital records, we're talking about paper records as well. So some possible steps. The first thing that organizations must do is to look across the organization to see what the functional areas are. This would have been done already because records are everywhere. But importantly, we now must begin to understand who are the persons who are responsible for managing the records in each of these functional areas. That person is the data executive. Who is the person who is authorized and is going to be held accountable if there is an issue in that section? So for each data executive, a separate plan of action should be crafted by records management. And for each functional area, we must recognize the types of personal data which is going to be processed in that area. Who are the custodians? These are the persons who handle it now. And how are they stored? And then records management would need to craft an assistance plan for the data executives, for the functional units, to manage personal data. And remember, I am separating out personal data from institutional data because there are ramifications for the mismanagement of personal data, which are different from those which have to do with institutional data. There are some clashes, and we must recognize this from a records management perspective. Yes, this has to be worked out. Records management normally has personal information intermingled, intermixed with other types of information. Also, regulations specify a records retention period. And really and truly, compliance is really achieved by, in some cases, indefinite retention. In some cases, not in every case. But in terms of the data protection or privacy space, personal information must be identified and classified. So what are you going to be doing as an organization? Are you going to be now breaking apart or disaggregating your files into institutional data or personal data? That is something that you have to think about very carefully. because there are 8 principles, and one of them indicates that personal data ought not to be retained for longer than it's necessary. And that's a tricky one. Also, and this is very, very important, the persons to whom data relates, the data subject, has a right to request access to or information about what you have for them. Now, the University of the West Indies is a huge organization. We have 50,000 current students, approximately. We have around 7,500 staff members, approximately. We have a huge alumni database. Can you imagine if all of those persons start to request information about what we hold for them? It's going to be a nightmare for us. So we have to put in place some policies to actually deal with how it's managed. And government will have to do the very same thing, because you're holding much larger data stores than us. So where do you start? Well, the first thing, understand the obligations. We have a very good panel now, and the panel can actually point in the right direction. And we're speaking specifically now to the Jamaica Data Protection Act of 2020. Understand the obligations. The good thing is that we are now in a transition period up to around 2023 December. So we have time to get our acts together. The other thing is create a team of persons from records management, from data protection. These will include, of course, your legal people, your IT people, but also your records management people. And also create or refine your policies. How many organizations right now have a data protection policy? How many persons have a data protection policy different from an information security policy? And they are different. And the last thing that you begin with is sensitization. Sensitize your staff, sensitize your publics, especially your customers, about what is coming. We have done so by coming up with some data privacy notices. We have done a general one, but we also do for specific categories, for students, for staff, for alumni. I recommend that you do all of these things as a starting point. The work really has not geared up yet. We're just starting. But again, the cheat sheet. There are 2 birds. There is 1 stone. Pull them together, and the challenge is to ensure that there is alignment between records management and data protection. We can help. That's my presentation. Over back to you, moderator.
Round of applause. Thank you very much, Dr. Anglin. Quite a bit of information to chew on. The Data Protection Act is there. Create a team. Create policy and procedures that we can all work with that will guide us. And very, very important to sensitize our stakeholders about their rights and their responsibilities. Wow. We have some questions that have come in, and I think we should just go right into the questions that I have. But if we have anybody with a question from the floor, we will also entertain those questions at this time. I believe I have an extra microphone here. So do we have any questions from persons in house? Yes, could somebody just assist with taking this microphone to the back? Thank you so much. But in the meantime, I have a couple of questions for our deputy from the Registrar's office, the Registrar General. And the question here says, how long does the RGD keep or store vital records? Your microphone? Let me see. It's on. It's on. Go ahead. How long does the RGD keep or store vital records?
So vital records, that's the birth, marriage, death, stillbirths, etc., we keep permanently. Those are not disposed of at all by law.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And understandably so.
Yes.
Because if I am doing a genealogical research, you're going to need to go back to my grandfather's grandfather and all of that. Okay.
Correct.
And what are the plans to digitize all records housed by the RGD?
So we plan to continue with the project that I mentioned earlier. We started with, in 2014, I believe, digitizing, scanning and indexing our records, and we have about 2.6 million records scanned and indexed first, and 3.3 digitized in the production database. So with the digitization project coming on through NIDS later this year, we should see the remaining birth records first being digitized, and that will be followed by the death and marriage.
Okay, and we did hear the difference between scanning and digitizing earlier on, so we know exactly what you're talking about. All right, let's take the question from the floor. Would you just say your name and ask the question?
Patricia Lawrence Powell, you actually answered the question, because what I really wanted to find out from a records management perspective with thinking sustainability, sustainable development, and of course how it is that records management translates into that development profile. So when you speak of the digitization process, I wanted to know how far you were with it and how it will impact the 30 days that the RGD has for regular requests for their birth certificate, because that is. So while we speak of the growth numbers, the growth aspect, I want to get the development aspect where our people no longer have to wait 30 days, especially those who are marginalized in terms of cash crunch. So you would have answered that question, and I hope that the outcome will see us moving from 30 days to a shorter time, because records management would so have allowed the same.
So if I can just expand, we have several service offerings. We have a same day, we have a next day, we have an express, that's within 3 to 4 days, and a 7 to 10 days, as well as a 30 day, which is our regular. So what we do is a process called quick print. So if you fall in the 3.3 million that have already been digitized, you can get your certificate same day, next day, through quick print, because we would already have the information digitized. And that's really where we're trying to go with our service, to get all of the information digitized so that we can get it accessible to you, not in the 30 days anymore, but as soon as you want it, you'll get it.
Great. So, I mean, that kind of shift on your website may all go well for the rest of the population. The second and final question for me, so I'm glad Mr. Cox is back. I wish the minister would be here, because I know Dwayne and Dr. Anglin would have touched on it. But more and more we find that legislations elsewhere have provisions for records keeping. I know the FAA legislation, which I celebrate every day as a records manager, really does provide for same. The Companies Act, the Banking Services Act, and some other pieces of legislation. And as I'm push for advocacy, a little pinch, that while you sit at the table and legislations are being developed, I'm just going to ask that provisions for records keeping, especially those that speaks to retention beyond mere statute of limitations, are considered. Sir Cox, I think you can convey on my behalf, even though you're not up there. Thank you.
That's
it.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from persons in the room? And do we have any questions from persons online? Because I do believe they have the capacity to drop. I have some. Is that our guest speaker in the back?
Yes,
or keynote speaker? I have some questions here for you, sir.
Okay.
But you go ahead, because I see some questions which look like the area of records management that you spoke about, the whole business of cloud storage. So would you like to ask a question and then take my question?
Sure.
Okay.
I hope I don't have to come back up. So one of the things that I would like to ask about, and I'm not sure how advanced or if there are any considerations for these, would be, so government services in some instances are requested through a form, but we're doing digital transformation now. Now, I know that some of these obligations or government processes are bound by statutes. So you actually look in the regulations, you see form A, B, so and so and so at the end. What does this mean then in terms of digital transformation and what ends up at JARD in terms of digital transformation? Because some of these forms are digital forms in Microsoft Forms and so forth. What are the considerations in terms of retention and disposition, and also to ensure that the legislators are aware of the implications? Because oftentimes we end up managing things that it's because a change in the legislation or the regulations are required, where we end up, for example, having long forms being managed where the signature, you have to fold it to tuck it into the file, and then that gets, through use, it gets lost, torn off, etc., and then that invalidates the document. What are the considerations for requesting these services through digital forms? And are there considerations for those digital forms? Because they are records of transactions to be then archived permanently. And I think that this impacts all the institutions that are represented on the platform, the university, RGD, JARD, in terms of, we oftentimes end up with indefinite retention, some of these records.
I think Mrs. Thomas wants to take a bite at that one. Yeah. Your microphone. All right, you're getting another. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. A very good question, Mr. Bryan, but we note that, for one, the process of deciding what is retained at the archive for posterity, it is anchored on the Archives Act. We are now going through a process with the RIM to look at revisiting the legislation. And as we go through the process, it will address forms, documents, and records. And we await that process. It takes some time, and we hope to accomplish that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Thomas. I have a question for you, Mr. Bryan, and it says, how do you see the records manager or director, documentation, information, and access services in developing RIM policies related to the cloud?
Okay, so if you don't mind me facilitating the question from here.
That's fine.
I believe that any considerations for cloud solutions should be collaborative. I believe that it's next to impossible to make any qualified decision on cloud without having your IT person there. Also, you need somebody in terms of policy development. Oftentimes, we end up doing things because there is a disconnect between the policy maker and what needs to happen in terms of operations. So you need executive sponsorship. So you would need somebody high enough on the totem pole within the organization, within the MDA, that can make decisions that will be bound, or which will bound the organization to the solution that's decided upon ultimately. But the decision should be qualified by having the input of IT, because the infrastructure needs to be supported or be able to be scaled as necessary. And you also need to have that agility through executive sponsorship, where if you need to make an adjustment, a major change, you have that reassurance right then and there. So I believe that the director of documentation and access would need to be part of a wider consultative process.
Yes.
What that needs to be in terms of supporting right across the government now is to have boilerplate approaches in terms of doing this. So depending on how it works in one MDA, you replicate that as a structured, standardized approach across GOJ.
All of the agencies and ministries. All right, thank you very much. I have another one for you, but I also have one for Mr. Dwaymian Brissett, and this says, how can legislators in the Caribbean better assist in developing records management programs? How can legislators in the Caribbean better assist in developing records management programs? This one I wanted to ask Mr. Brissett to take. If Mr. Brissett is still online?
Yes, I am.
Yes, go right ahead. Did you hear the question?
So, yes, I did.
Okay.
So legislators can assist by first, before legislation are developed, have the Joint Select Committee of Parliament have professionals on it who are practitioners in the area. So a government archivist, maybe a records manager from UA, director of documentation and access service from ministries, somebody from the private sector, and those persons will be able to help in doing the groundwork. And then based on that report, then they create legislation. So we will have more harmonized legislation rather than legislation all over the place that speaks to records. And you only know when somebody would have contravened an area and the matter may require to go to court or mediation. And that is when you know that, there was a provision in the Companies Act that records are supposed to be held for 7 years. But not everybody, or not every records manager are legally trained, or some are not legally trained. Some works where there's no lawyers in-house either to give them any legal advice. So our legislators need to have us on board, the practitioners on board more in the groundwork stage. So by the time you reach drafting instruction and actually creating the legislation or the regulation, it will be one that is fit for purpose, because you had the input of the practitioners. Because some legislation that comes out, when you see them, even the practitioners which is supposed to affect is having a challenge with it, because it's just not fit for purpose. It is highfalutin and sometimes far-fetched, and that is why you have them amending and amending and amending. And sometimes we don't do a good job of putting our amendments in one place. So you might be giving opinions based on dated information if you are not meticulous and a researcher who likes to dig deep for information. So that is what I think our legislators can do. Yes. Don't rush and create legislation, but speak to your practitioners who are doing the daily work. We are in the trenches.
Yes, yes.
Hear from us first.
So very important to have the input of people who are on the ground, who are managing the data on a daily basis. Yes. I believe, Mrs. Thomas, you wanted to make a point? Oh, we have another person with a question here. Please go right ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Personal files are generated by all ministries. And although we talk about records, we do have challenges with the management of these personal files in terms of pension. And I suppose the challenges are most obvious when pensions are to be calculated and we have people who have served the public sector 25, 30, 35 years and they're out there not able to get their pension because of poor record management practices. Now, what are the guidelines? A lot is happening. We're going IT. We're riding straight up the IT alley. In terms of management of these personal files that have implications for a person's ability to survive after they have given years of good service to the public sector. How does that affect the regular man on the street? So I understand the birth and death records, but and let me take a minute to share. I was at a school as a principal in 2013 when a lady said she had taught there in 1971, came back to ask for record because she could not get her pension after she was supposed to have retired. How do we allow those things to happen? And going forward, how do we stop them from happening? Because as I said, to me, I mean, after you have worked hard and long, that should not be an issue. So that's a ministry issue, and it happens across ministries. How do we deal with personnel records? Thank you.
And thank you very much. Passionate question and a very real question being asked. Do we have anyone on the panel who can probably give some kind of insight? Mrs. Thomas, is that?
I'm really trying to encourage Mr. Cox.
You're trying to encourage Mr. Cox to respond? Mr. Cox from the Information Division in the Office of the Prime Minister. Mr. Cox, you can utilize the microphone that's across the way. Yes?
Mrs. Thomas could have fielded the question or the answer.
I think she wants to hear from you.
the efforts that the GOJ is making now, buttressed by the government of Jamaica RIM policy, and the project implementation part of that policy is about ensuring that those things don't happen anymore. The standardization of proper records and information management practices. So that is about transforming JARD, building capacity in terms of RIM practitioners, the utilization of technology as well. So some of the things that would have happened before based on gaps, as you see, the theme is bridging the gaps. The whole architecture of what we're doing in terms of policy, implementation, putting in the systems in place within ministries, departments, and MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies, is about correcting those gaps, and also ensuring we build the capacity, both from a technology standpoint and a human resource standpoint, to ensure that we are doing things according to standards, that we're protecting personal information. A lot of the information that we held in terms of personal files will be personal information, so privacy protection as well, securing the ICT infrastructure in terms of cybersecurity. So it's all integrated in terms of the approach that's being taken to strengthen records and information management and also the management of information assets.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You
want to add? Go ahead.
Just one small bit is that the government has started.
I'm happy to.
We have, it is obvious, and I would like to indicate that the My HR Plus is also tagged on to this program. So My HR Plus is designed to address all these HR records issues, which would eventually come to the level to address the pension situation. So many government entities have now started that program.
Okay, and one last comment before I leave. We're talking about bridging the gap. So you spoke about HR. I am from the Library and Information Training Institution. In terms of collaborations, are there gaps there that need to be bridged? So we are the persons training the records manager, but we feel on our side sometimes a little distant from the persons who need the skills that we're training for. Is there possibility that there's a gap there that maybe we need to address? Because we want to be sure that the persons who leave our institution are able to do what is required when they get out there on the field. Thank you very much.
So then you're talking about a need for greater collaboration.
Definitely.
And for your training for the market needs.
Yes, definitely.
Or the demands that are there in the workspace.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
And that is also covered in the RIM program. There is one key results area which addresses capacitation.
Okay. Thank you very much. I heard another voice.
Can I add as well?
Sure. Go right ahead.
Yes, I also think that the Department of Library and Information Studies need to also get themselves out there and do. It's the department that trains researchers, and as such, I would impress upon them to do some research for themselves in the market to see if the skill set that they are giving us, if that's the skill set that the market really requires at this time. And it would be more informed for them, and they would know the skills, the gaps, and all that, and how to design programs to fix the same. So the practitioners alone cannot, and the government, the library school, who is the lead trainer in the Caribbean, has to do some work as well.
Okay, so it's many sides of the coin. I believe Mr. Bryan wants to make a point as well.
Right. Just to point out that oftentimes with these kinds of events, these encounters, we run the risk of, because it's a technical sphere, right? Records management. We're not trying to get everybody to understand 15489. I think that we need to ensure that policy makers understand the support that's required for records management. So ISO 30300 would be the go-to standard in terms of the management system for records management, where the policymaker needs to understand, look, my records manager needs to have a reporting framework that lends itself to having ongoing performance monitoring. Readjustments should be accommodated. It's too, because we're government, we're fixed in that there is a cap, there's a limit to how far up you can go. But what about advocacy? Does the person doing the records keeping inside the ministry understands how important it is, right? It's my role since I started in records keeping was to evangelize people. There's no other better description, evangelize people. It's only when you end up in a scenario, as in the scenario about the pensions, you realize, look, I mean, as a records keeper, I am also dependent on a colleague in another entity providing the same service. Right. So yeah, it's not, because remuneration is low, it's monotonous, you need to go out there and you know, advocacy needs to happen really, you know, with the support of the policymakers to ensure that there's that buy-in, right? And also in terms of the whole pension thing, the service record, is the service record being digitized? The service record is what they use to determine all of these things. How many days leave, appointments, acting appointments and such. But then there needs to be like a point forward system that goes back to the whole conversation about this form being recognized as the record. So you do your backfile conversion and then you have a point forward approach. How do we deal with these procedures moving forward, right? So that's just a comment I wanted to make on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bryan. I had a question for Dr. Anglin. We heard him talking about data protection and records management. And I wanted to ask, what are some of the challenges facing records and information professionals in Jamaica and the Caribbean? You're on the ground, you're doing the work. What is your own experience? Is Dr. Anglin?
Yes, I'm still here, Marlene.
Okay.
So one of the things that we have noticed, and this is a very specific example, it's in terms of the magnitude of records as they are now in the digital space. So let's use email as an example. And classification of email becomes very, very difficult because an email might be a record or it might not be a record. However, the problem is that very few systems which are affordable are available for, and let me use the term archival from the technology side and not from the records management side. Very few products are out there which we can afford, which allows us to archive email in a manner which allows them to be retained based on the records management policy. So that's one example. We do have that challenge now, just looking across at the scope of what records are going to look like and how do we manage them. So for example, you might have a large organization like ours, and we have tons of email going to our email system on a daily basis.
Yes.
The question is, how do you now look across those and categorize them? So that's a big challenge. Another challenge from a records management perspective is just to get buy-in from your normal day-to-day worker who is not a records management professional. Because everybody manages records. Even if you're not a records management professional, yes. You either create, you either edit, you either view a record. So we're not just talking about disposition. So those persons now we need to bring them into the fold in respect of how do you actually manage, and I'm speaking about personal data now, how do you actually manage personal data in a manner which does not lead to a breach of whatever policy the organization has put in place. So those are two of the challenges that we've actually encountered. And I've seen it across the Caribbean, not only in Jamaica. One of them is really determining scope. The other one is to get buy-in from the normal man on the ground, normal person.
Yes. A very interesting point that you make, and an example comes right to mind as you spoke just now. So someone sends an email to their HR department to request a deduction for pension to the maximum, that now becomes a record. But if the person on the ground is not sensitized, then it's just another email. So I move on. And when it's time for me to tie up all of my business, I say, oh, but there's no record of you, whatever, we sent X amount of money. And so there's no record, nothing to verify. And I'm learning quite a bit here today. Please go ahead with your question.
I'm asking this question on behalf of the attendees on Zoom. Stefan Peart has a two-part question. The first question is, in light of all that was shared, what measures are in place to have the general public involved in the powerful initiative? Mrs. Thomas, you want to take this one?
No, I am saying today's event is the first step. This is the first step. And we will continue to have various webinars and sensitization sessions so that the public will get an opportunity to understand that all of government creates records of value, which they need to be aware of how it's managed and also participate in that management so that they will not be left out. Data protection, they need to know what data they have out there and how is it being protected, what privacy considerations, all of this. There is a bigger picture, and I am happy that Mr. Cox is here to really hear some of the concerns, and as we go back to consult and to work the process through, we will take some of these information concerns shared at the table.
The second question from Mr. Peart is, are we fostering these best practices within our educational institutions?
Are we?
We hope.
How do we move it from a hope to...
No, so if we recall, the Records and Information Management Program is also engaged in educational institutions.
And Dr. Anglin, I think, wanted to jump in to make a comment.
Anglin.
Go ahead, Dr. Anglin.
Yeah, so because we are the largest educational institution across the Caribbean, we have been entrenching best practices in our own operational practices. So that's the first thing. And then right now, we have not started to integrate these practices into our training regime, but that is coming. Because what we have done is we have taken data protection and elevated it to the highest level of the organization. So, for example, myself, I report directly to the CEO, and our CEO is a vice chancellor. And I have oversight across the entire system, all 17 countries in the Caribbean and all 10 across the world. So what we have done, we have gotten executive buy-in, but not only buy-in, we have put executive implementation in place. It starts there. Now, we have ensured that these are tied into our HR practices. So a basic concept is privacy by design. And we have to start thinking that way. Whenever you're going to be doing anything at all, from conceptualization, think privacy. But when you're going to acquire a solution, think privacy. When you're going to use a solution, think privacy. And when you're going to get rid of the solution, think privacy. So those are some of the things. And I'm being very, very simplistic here because of the audience. But those are some of the things that we're doing.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Anglin. You have one more question. Go right ahead.
Okay, this question is from Ranford Campbell. Do we collect metadata in our records collections?
By default. By default.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question coming. I have one on paper that somebody sent me that I would like to ask, and the panelists can decide who will take this one, but you go right ahead.
I don't want to be a troublemaker for you, Mr. Cox. So having heard all of these things and the importance of records management, I wore the hat as the advocacy chair for the Library and Information Association of Jamaica. And we know our practitioners and team, and we are in the business now, are trying to be nice, in terms of transformation, the transformation unit looking at salaries and benefits and so forth. What is there now? And I know you understand for records and the importance. Are we clearly looking at this group? Because the last conversation we had, this group really was missing from the survey. And I'm asking on behalf of my colleagues and friends that having understand now more than ever and having gone through 60 years of diamond engagements, what opportunities we now have at the table that are my colleagues and myself are duly compensated to continue on this trajectory, because we are certainly way below where we ought to be based on our impact on national development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Cox is going to take to the microphone to attempt a response to that question.
Attempt is right? All right. Well, we know the context. If we're talking about compensation review, we know that's in the purview of the Ministry of Finance, and that is underway in terms of looking at, as it said, looking at what government needs, the ability to retain professionals, right? Recruit and retain professionals that can deliver services at the level that the government requires, deliver excellent service to members of the public. As part of the project, so one of the components is looking at the competency profile of RIM practitioners, looking at the professionalization and professional skills that are currently being undertaken and what will be required going forward. Also, across government, we're talking about the development of professional pathways. So there's a lot of things happening in terms of the transformation of the public service and looking at the human resource component of it. And obviously part of that is the compensation part of it, right? Yeah. But in terms of the compensation review, looking at the categories and so on, that rests with the Ministry of Finance, but obviously as part of the project, looking at what is required from professionals and what is required to ensure that we deliver records and information management services that are fit for purpose for a modern state and where we want to go in terms of a developed country. That is something that is a part of our consultations and review.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Damian Cox, Acting Principal Director in the Information Division of the Office of the Prime Minister. I have another question for you, Ms. Clough. It says, how do we document the movement of records from one location to another?
Okay, thanks for that question. So we have several mechanisms that we employ at the RGD to document. Most of them are electronic. So if you make an application, for example, we have what is called the application tracking system that tracks the record being pulled from a vault and using the processing of that application, and that information is documented in the application tracking system. So you would get a tracking number as an applicant, specific and unique to you, and we can always punch that number into the system and see where the record was pulled, if it was found in the first place, where it was pulled from. All of that information is in the application tracking system. We have manual systems as well that are at the hospitals. So we are in all major hospitals across the island. So for example, UWI, we don't have facilities to accommodate electronic use right now, but until then we use a manual process where we log it in a book. Yes.
All right, so I hope that answers that question. We have run out of time, but the questions have been coming in, and we're just going to take one final question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. And I'm not so sure who will take this one, but it says, what are some of the challenges that the GDPR legislation, and somebody needs to tell me what GDPR means, legislation passed in Europe will have in managing digital records? What are some of the challenges that the GDPR legislation passed in Europe will have in managing digital records? Are you able to take that, Mr. Bryan?
Yes. So the General Data Protection Regulation is an European Union is an European law that prohibits misuse of personal data for European subjects. Of course, people move. We have European nationals here in Jamaica, and there are some heavy penalties under the GDPR in terms of misuse of information. But the awareness campaign, needs to be, I think, ratcheted up a little bit more here locally in Jamaica, because I don't think most people are aware Jamaica is a party to the Economic Partnership Agreement, which is a trade agreement with the EU. This requires that in terms of movement of data between jurisdictions, that there has to be an adequacy qualifier, meaning that sometimes a Jamaican professional or company who is bidding on an opportunity in Europe that involves the movement or management of such information, such data, they're unable to meet the requirements. Why? Because we don't have a robust enough set of regulations. We don't have a compliance framework that's robust enough. So that's a combination of your laws, policies, etc., and practices that will give the reassurance of the contemporary on the other side that their information will be treated in the way it ought to be. So, for example, a simple thing, somebody booking a flight to Jamaica from Brussels, that information has to be treated with the respect that's afforded. Some of this travel document is a very big thing.
Yes.
The vital details inherent in that transaction, there should be some reassurance by the vendor on this end that we're only keeping your details. Sometimes I ask for photocopies or details that could in other jurisdictions be used to create a separate identity.
Yes.
Right? But we have very thin compliance frameworks in the Caribbean, so we don't have a culture of having our identities stolen like that as much.
Yes.
But I can tell, living in the U.S., in Europe, that is a big deal, and we ought to have some considerations for those types of scenarios in place before somebody gets hit with a fine.
Yes.
And since I'm on the floor, I want to take this opportunity just to signal that, having worked with JARD over the years, it's Herculean, the kind of work, the output of JARD is way beyond the resources currently available. I think that JARD has been doing a lot with what they have, but I think that there needs to be further resourcing if you're serious about RIM. In terms of looking at the compliance framework, you need to have some legal resource in JARD itself, not tapping into the legal unit of either OPM or some other ministry, but somebody
within
in JARD
yes.
that understands records and will be looking at it from that perspective. Mm-hmm. You also need to have somebody that's competent in terms of the IT landscape in JARD, not dependent on the parent ministry, if you will, to provide that kind of resourcing. It's really too much. We really have so many things. Records management is a very dynamic field. And to ask the department to be, and I hope I'm not overstepping, but it's really a lot. If you look at the volume and breadth of what we have discussed just today alone, and we have not touched on some of the other issues.
And there are many other questions that are coming up.
Bring your own devices and all of those issues.
You won't have time.
It's a lot. Yes. So just want to put it out there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brian, and thank you for being our keynote speaker for today. A lot of information has been shared. Let me just take the opportunity as we close to thank our Minister, Honorable Robert Nestor Morgan, for sharing with us earlier on, giving us such a good overview of the portfolio in the Office of the Prime Minister. That's the information portfolio in the Office of the Prime Minister. Want to thank Mr. Dwayne Brissett, Information Services and Communications Manager, Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court in Castries, St. Lucia, who spoke to us about laws and regulations governing the management of records in the digital age. Ms. Tamika Clough, Director, Operations Management Division and the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for the Registrar General's Department, effective management of vital event records. And I'm already taken, so I won't have to do the, what did you call it? The no impediment search. But thank you so much for sharing with us and for bringing us up to date on some of those services that you have to offer. Dr. Patrick Anglin, a gentleman who has been around for some time and in the thick of things, University Data Protection Officer, University of the West Indies Regional Headquarters, looking at the implications of Jamaica's data protection legislation on operations and records management. And I made a note, Dr. Anglin, of those 8 core principles. And I really learned a lot today just by participating. Of course, it would not have been possible without the wonderful people who showed up today to have a hybrid session. We have an audience here and we also have an audience online. And we want to thank you so much for your participation, for your questions, for your comments, and for your enthusiasm. It's 60 years and sharing a birthday with Jamaica. A lot of work has been done and there's still so much more to be done. I have learned a lot by being here, and I'm also part of the government in that I work with a government agency, and I have seen where the lone champion for records information management has not really been lauded or given too much, paid, as my granny would say, paid too much mind. But I actually leave here today with a greater appreciation, and that is what I hope that persons who have been listening in, who are not themselves RIM professionals, but just the average Joe, who perhaps would have tuned in, would have taken away from today's activities. I wish for you all the best and many, many successes for your activities of the month. And I'll remind our viewers, on the 20th, an online records management training in appraisal and disposition. On the 27th, training in project management for RIM professionals. And of course, give them a call. The numbers are 922-370-526. They will facilitate virtual tours during this month of activities. And we look forward to your RIM zine. I would love to have a copy when it's ready for publication. So, thank you so much. And thanks to all the persons who came together to make it happen. The persons here who represented the Jamaica Pegasus and have been doing very well in terms of service. Members of the Jamaica Information Service, all of the crew. We also had my good friend, Dr. Orville Taylor. I've known him for over 40 years. And we have been friends, yes. And he was broadcasting live on RGR 94, sharing this information with many of their listeners as well. So important that we sensitize and share the information and get on board. And as I close, do remember that good records management brings better governance. Thank you so much for being with us. God bless and enjoy the rest of your day.